So we're on 2.4.7, that's the correct verse. That's what our I haven't been able to attend the last couple of days because I've had other things going on in the morning, but that's what Hari Vilas had me down for, I believe it is, if I can. Yeah? Okay. There's a schedule that he sent out, and that's what's listed on the schedule. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Om Ajnanatirmirandasya Gananjana Shalakaya Chakshur Anmilitam Yena Tasmai Shri Gurave Namaha Shri Chaitanya Manobishtam Stapitam Yena Bhutale Swayam Rupa Kadamahyam Dadati Swapadantikam Vandeham Shri Guru Shri Yuta Pada Kamalam Shri Gurun Vaishnavamscha Shri Rupam Sagrajatam Sahagana Raghunatan Vitam Tam Sajivam Sadvaitam Savadhunam Parijana Sahitam Krishna Chaitanya Devam Shri Radha Krishna Padam Sahagana Lalita Shri Vishakanvitamscha Hey Krishna Karuna Sindho Dinabandho Jagatpate Gopesha Gopika Kanta Radha Kanta Namostute Tapta Kanchana Gaurangi Radhe Vrindavan Eshvari Vrishabhanu Sute Devi Pranamami Hari Priye Vanchakalpa Tarubhyascha Kripa Sindhubhya Evacha Patitanam Bhavan Ebhyo Vaishnavebhyo Namo Namaha Shri Krishna Chaitanya Prabhu Nityananda Shri Advaita Gadadhara Shri Vasadi Gaur Bhakta Vrinda Hare Krishna 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 Hare 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 Rama 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 Hare 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 Krishna 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 Hare 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 Rama Rama Hare Hare. So our verse is Yata Gopayati Vibhur Yata Gopayati Vibhur Yata Samyachate Punaha Yata Samyachate Punaha Yang Shaktim Upasritya Yang Shaktim Upashritya Purushakti Parapuman Purushakti Parapuman Atmanam Kridayan Kridan Atmanam Kridayan Kridan Karoti vikaroti cha. Karoti vikaroti cha. Yatha gopayati vibhur. Yatha samyachate punaha. Yang yang shaktim upashritya. Puru shakti parapuman. Atmanam kridayan kridan. Karoti vikaroti cha. Yatha gopayati vibhur. Yatha samyachate punaha. Yang yang shaktim upasritya. Puru shakti parapuman. Atmanam kridayan kridan. Karoti vikaroti cha. Yatha gopayati vibhur. Yatha samyachate punaha. Yang yang shaktim upasritya. Puru shakti parapuman. Atmanam kridayan kridan. Karoti vikaroti cha. Yatha gopayati vibhur. Yatha samyachate punaha. Yam yam shaktim upasritya. Puru shakti parapuman. Adhanam kridayan kridan. Karoti vikaroti cha. Yata as. Gopayati maintains. Vibhu, the great. Yatha as. Samyachate winds up. Punaha again. Yang yam as. Shaktim energies. Upashritya by employing. Puru shaktihi the all-powerful. Paraha the supreme. Puman personality of Godhead. Atmanam plenary expansion. Kridayan having engaged them. Kridan as also personally being engaged. Karoti does them. Vikaroti and causes to be done. Cha and. Kindly, this is the translation of the verse, kindly describe how the Supreme Lord, who is all-powerful, engages his different energies and different expansions in maintaining and again winding up the phenomenal world in the sporting spirit of a player. So I say, and you please repeat. Kindly describe how the Supreme Lord, who is all-powerful, engages his different energies and different expansions in maintaining and again winding up the phenomenal world in the sporting spirit of a player. So we have a purport today here by Srila Prabhupada. In the Katha Upanishad 2.2.13, the Supreme Lord is described as the chief eternal amongst all other eternal individual beings. Nityo Nityanam Chaitanas Chaitananam. And the one Supreme Lord who maintains the innumerable other individual living beings. Eko Bahunam Yo Vidadati Kaman. So all living beings, both in the conditioned state and in the liberated state, are maintained by the Almighty Supreme Lord. Such maintenance is effected by the Lord through his different expansions of self and three different principal energies, namely the internal, external, and marginal energies. The living entities are his marginal energy, and some of them, in the confidence of the Lord, are entrusted with the work of creation also, as are Brahma, Marichi, etc. And the acts of creation are inspired by the Lord unto them. Tene Brahma Hrida. The external energy, Maya, is also impregnated with the jivas, or conditioned souls. The unconditioned marginal potency acts in the spiritual kingdom, and the Lord, by his different plenary expansions, maintains them in different transcendental relations displayed in the spiritual sky. The unconditioned marginal potency acts in the spiritual kingdom, and the Lord, by his different plenary expansions, maintains them in different transcendental relations displayed in the spiritual sky. So the one Supreme Personality of Godhead himself manifests in many Bahusyam, and thus all the diversities are in him, and he is in all diversities, although he is nevertheless different from all of them. That is the inconceivable mystic power of the Lord. And as such, everything is simultaneously one with and different from him by his inconceivable potencies, achintya veda veda tattva. Yata gopayati vibhur yata samyachate punaha yang shaktim pasritya puru shakti parapuman atmanam kridayan kridan karoti vikaroti cha. Kindly describe how the Supreme Lord, who is all-powerful, engages his different energies and different expansions in maintaining and again winding up the phenomenal world in the sporting spirit of a player. This is part of a series of questions that are being specifically asked of Sukadeva Goswami by Parikshit. Just as we see in chapters of the first canto, chapter 2, and I think in chapter 3 as well, there are some questions being set up. And those questions are spoken. In Canto 1, those questions are being spoken by Shonaka Rishi to the sages at Naimisharanya. But here, the questions are being spoken by Parikshit Maharaj to Sukadeva Goswami. And we have read some of them. Yesterday's verse was that. And some more will follow in the coming verses. We will hear more questions. And then, boom, the rest of the Bhagavatam will start to be expanded by Shukadeva Goswami. In this particular verse, Parikshit is asking how the Lord expands various different energies. The Supreme Lord, Parasya Shaktir Vividaya Shriyate, has multiple expanded energies of various kinds. And his energies are mysterious because they do anything and everything. And his energies are maintaining and expanding the spiritual world, and they're maintaining and expanding the material world. Not exactly in the same identical way, but his energies work one way in the spiritual world, and his energies work a different way in the material world. You know, the spiritual world is expanded by his internal potency, and that's primarily working there. And the material world is mostly his external potency. We've been kind of talking about that in some various previous classes. The external energy of the Lord is expanded from the Brahm Jyoti. So sometimes even the material world is described as Brahman, which is interesting. Sometimes the Supreme, the Brahman is described as being totally spiritual. And it is what comprises the white light, which is the boundary between the spiritual and the material world. So on one side of the boundary of the Brahman is the spiritual world. On the other side of the boundary of Brahman is the material world. And it is said that by glancing at the material world, the Brahman is covered by Maya and becomes the first Pradhan and then what we call the Mahatat. So the Pradhan is undifferentiated, but when it begins to be disturbed out of equilibrium, it becomes what we call the Mahatat. And then this gradually begins to expand into the three modes of nature. Prior to that is ahankara, or false ego. And then the three modes of nature couple with the false ego and start to produce the 24 elements that we call the elements of Sankhya philosophy. So our reality, the material energy that we walk around in, is expanded from a version of the Brahman. So sometimes it's said it's directly Brahman, as Prabhupada says it in the 10th canto of Śhrīmad-Bhāgavatam. And sometimes it's described as being Brahman covered by Maya, and sometimes it's described as expanding from Brahman. The material energy expands from Brahman. The Supreme Lord causes this expansion, which is described in various places as the universe is bubbling out of the Lord's breathing in and out of his puras. And this exists for some time. And the Supreme Lord inhales, so when he exhales, all the universes bloom out of the Supreme Lord. And when he inhales, they all recede back into him and become once again unmanifest. They do a reversal of what we were just talking about. So we have the Shrishti, or the creational episode, and then later on we have the Nirodha, or the destructional episode. The material universe is like the breathing of an individual. They are manifested when the breathing is external, and they become unmanifested when the breathing goes internal. The Supreme Lord is continually doing this, but the entire cycle, as we learn that there are 4 yugas. There's the Satya Yuga, Treta Yuga, Dwapara, and Kali Yuga. The Satya Yuga is the longest age. Kali Yuga is the shortest age, which is only 432,000 years long. So Kali Yuga is 432,000 years long. Dwapara is twice as long, so that makes it 864,000 years long. And Treta Yuga is 3 times as long, and Satya Yuga is 4 times as long as Kali Yuga. When you add 4 plus 3 plus 2 plus 1, you get 10. So the entire Divya Yuga then is 10 times the length of Kali Yuga, making it 4,320,000 years long. This comprises one cycle of the 4 ages, which are like the seasons. We have winter, summer, spring, and we have spring, summer, fall, and winter. And then again, we have another spring, summer, fall, and winter. In a similar way, these 4 yugas, Satya, Treta, Dwapara, and Kali, repeat. And they repeat 1,000 times to make one single day of Brahma. And an equal duration of time repeats to make the nighttime of Brahma. So Brahma's full 24-hour day consists of 1,000 yuga cycles that make up Brahma's day, and 1,000. Now we're not talking about just one yuga, we're talking about all 4 yugas, which is sometimes referred to as a Divya Yuga. So all 4 of them repeat 1,000 times for the day, and an equal duration happens at night, although there's absolutely nothing going on at night. The heavenly worlds, some of the higher planets are still functional during the nighttime. But as far as the regular material world, it's more or less merged into nescience in the Garbha ocean. So this is just one day of Brahma, and that makes one day of Brahma 4,320,000,000 years long. We're starting to get into these astronomical numbers, So it's actually interesting that Carl Sagan once made the statement that in the Indian explanation of time was the only time scale which was similar to the scientist time scale. And he added the little clause, probably by accident. He couldn't countenance the fact that possibly there could be something deeper than that. But at any rate, the interesting thing is that this is just one of Brahma's days, and then he has 30 days in a month and 12 months in a year, making 360 days in a year, and he lives 100 years of those 360 days, which blooms out the figure for an entire lifetime of Brahma, which is the duration of one full exhalation of Mahavishnu, and then when he inhales, it's all over. And that only takes a mere 411 trillion years, or 311 trillion years, something like that, some huge number like that. So the Supreme Lord creates the universes, he winds them up, and he creates them, and he winds them up, and this cycle goes perpetually. So the universes are sometimes unmanifested and sometimes manifested. And this is what's being described here. The material world has a purpose, and the spiritual world has a purpose. And this is interesting here that, the Supreme Lord does this with his various energies. And we generally describe the internal, external, and marginal energies, which are in Sanskrit. His external energy is the Bahiranga Shakti, the Bahiranga Shakti. The internal energy is the Antaranga Shakti, and the marginal energy is the Tatastha Shakti. We are the Tatastha Shakti, the marginal energy. We are between two great energies. Sometimes it's described like the beach in a ocean. So on one side is a vast ocean, on the other side is a vast tract of land, and in between the vast ocean and the vast tract of land there is a buffer zone or an intermediate region we call the beach, where sometimes it's covered by water and sometimes it's dry. It's when the moon tides through, then some parts of the beach become dry. And later on they become wet and then they become dry. So we are like that middle portion between the ocean and the land. So sometimes we are fully dry, we are identifying with our spiritual nature, and other times we are fully wet, we are identifying with the material nature. So we have to identify with one of the two, there's no third option. So we are either identifying with the material or the spiritual energy. If we identify with the spiritual energy intensely and long enough, we become purified and we become qualified to leave the material world altogether. We don't have to stay here anymore. We can go back to where we came from, the spiritual world. And there everything is eternal. Which are innumerable spiritual planets where the Lord engages in pastimes with his devotees. But in the center is Goloka Vrindavan, where the Lord performs specific pastimes of a more intimate nature than are found in the Vaikuntha lokas. There is a reference here that in the material world, there are a few living entities who are given special, powers or special abilities to be able to perform creation on behalf of the Lord. So, in this second canto, Śhrīmad-Bhāgavatam, we have Atro Sarga Visargascha Stanam Poshanam Utaya Manvantar Ishanukata Nirodho Muktir Ashraya. So there are 10 subject matters of the Śrīmad-Bhāgavatam. Sarga, which is creation, and Visarga, which is subsequent creation. So first there is creation by the Supreme. He creates all the building materials. Then we have Brahma coming in, and Brahma performs the actual construction of the house. So first we have the building materials, which are created by the Supreme Lord. Then we have Brahma, that's subsequent creation. So Atra Sargo Visargascha Stanam, the planetary systems, Poshanam, the protection of the Lord, Utaya, the creative impetus, Manvantara, the various Manvantaras and their durations and their purpose. Ishanukata talks about the Supreme Lord. Nirodho, which is the winding up of the universe. Muktir is liberation, Utaya, and Ashraya rather. Nirodho, Muktir, Ashraya. Ashraya is the summum bonum, Prabhupada usually translates it. And the summum bonum means the final thing, Krishna. So this canto is focused quite extensively on the creation. We are hearing a lot about it. In later episodes of Śhrīmad-Bhāgavatam, we begin to hear about the winding up of the universe. But the winding up of the universe is just kind of like playing a cassette backwards. You know, it's just everything just doing the opposite thing. Instead of things gradually differentiating and detailing out and becoming more intricate, the opposite happens. Things merge, they become less intricate, and finally we have the white light again, or the Mahatat disintegrates back into the Pradhan, where there is no differentiation. It's just whiteness. Nothing changes. There's no difference anywhere. It's the same everywhere. Of course, many people have the mistaken notion that the white light is the highest thing, that it is the expression of the Supreme. And the Vedas do describe the Brahma-Jyoti as being expression of the Supreme. But beyond the Brahma-Jyoti is the full spiritual world, which is not bland and white and undifferentiated. The spiritual world has form of all sorts, more form than we have here in this material world, because this material world is just a carbon copy, or sometimes I call it a Kmart version of the spiritual world. We have a funkier version of it here. And the living entities come here to try to lord it over material nature, which of course never works, but most people never figure that out. They just attempt to enjoy the material world. And though it doesn't work time and time again, we just don't cotton on. We just go right ahead and attempt to enjoy it again and again and again. Puna puna charvita charvananam. Again and again, chewing the chewed. So Brahma, as Prabhupada says, is one of the living entities, just like in a prison system, because this material world is a prison. You have the inmates who, due to good behavior, get special tasks that the regular prisoners don't get, because they haven't shown themselves to be reformed at all. But Brahma, who is an important person in the universal expansion, he gets the prerogative to be able to expand the material universe. He gets to do that. And Marichi, I think, I didn't get a chance to look up exactly what Marichi does. I think he's a Prajapati, and he's part of the whole system of filling the world with various entities. And Prabhupada quotes that from Tene Brahma Hrida, which is, of course, from the first canto. It's the first verse of the Śrīmad-Bhāgavatam. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya Janmani Yasya Yatom Vedaditara Teshtra Teshtra Vigyasara Tene Brahma Hridi Adikavi Muyanti Yat Surya Hejavari Mridam Yata Vinamayo Yatratri Sargo Mrisha Damna Sena Sadana Rasta Kuhakam Satyam Param Dhimahi. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. It takes several breaths to say that one. That's the first verse. And it's an amazing kind of description of the Supreme Lord. In the religions of the world, the Supreme Lord is glorified and placed in an important understanding at the center of all religious thinking. But there are precious few details about the Supreme Lord. But this verse describes many things about the Supreme Lord, how he is creating the manifested and unmanifested universes. He's the one who inspires the Lord Brahma in the heart, and due to him, the demigods and everyone else are bewildered in the material world, and he makes the material world appear factual, although in fact it is temporary and ephemeral. And as well, he has his own abode, which is beyond. So a lot of things are explained in that very, very, very first verse of Śrīmad-Bhāgavatam. This is an amazing verse, actually. So This is the first time I've come across this little Sanskrit Bahusyam. I've never, somehow or another, it's never stuck in my mind before. But it means, Bahu means many, Sham means to become. And I did a search on it, and it's in Prabhupada's teachings in a number of places, and what's the rest of it is different depending on different places. In some places it's Eko Bahusham, other places is Tad Ikshata Bahusham. So Tad Ikshatam Bahusham refers to the Supreme Lord looking at the material energy, and by my glance I shall become many. That's what that means, Tadikshata Bahusham. By my glance, my one will become many, meaning the living entities are being generated and expanded into the material world. And similarly to making dough, you know, when I don't know if any of you have ever made dough for pizza or for bread or something like that. You get these little yeasts, you know. And in my earlier days, I worked in pizza restaurants. So it was one of my illustrious occupations. And you have to get water at just the right temperature. It can't be too hot and it can't be too cold. And if you're smart, you'll put a tiny bit of sugar in there too, so the yeast get something to eat when they come out of their hibernation. And you put them in there and they go down to the bottom. And they sit there for a while. And if you've done your stuff right, in about 10 minutes, they go whoop, and they come back up to the top. And then you know that they're ready to go. And then you mix the oil and salt and the flour together, and it goes whoop, because the yeasts are expanding, you know, and they are, in a similar way, the living entities are plucked or plunged into the material world, and they begin to cause the material world to, you know, dance and sing. So we have to have the material world full of living entities who have their various karmas, and they cause things to happen. So the Supreme Lord is one, but he becomes many. He expands by his vision, he plunges the living entities into the material world, and there, due to their karma, they take up various forms, some higher and some lower. And this, of course, in the material world is due to the living entities having a particular material desire. So all the living entities in the material world have a particular collection of material desires. And besides having a particular collection of material desires, they have a particular type of past karma which is built up behind them. So we have a past karma and we have desires, and that's why there are so many different kinds of living entities and different kinds of desire. You know, I think tomorrow's verse are going to talk about planetary systems as well. So it's interesting that the universe is full of so many different planets, and each one of them has a very different atmosphere. And we would not be able to survive in the atmosphere of a different planet unless we had some protective, suit, which is why, you know, you always see this idea of space suits. So each planet has a different karma associated with it, and therefore living entities who are able to live in one are unable to live in another, even on this earth. We cannot live in the bottom of the ocean, and fish cannot live on the top of a mountain. There are living entities who are perfectly suited for a particular type of environment and completely unable to live in a different environment. the Supreme Lord creates the spiritual world for his pastimes with his living entities who are favorable toward him, who have had a favorable relationship with him. The material world, however, is for all of us Plan B people who decided we wanted to try Plan B. We didn't like Plan A. Plan A is hang out in the spiritual world and engage with Krishna in various pastimes. Okay, you don't want to do that, you get to do Plan B. Into the material world. Tad aikshata bahushyam. So we get plunged into the material world, and here the Plan B is we are living in a place with birth, death, old age, and disease, and we get the chance to try to enjoy the material energy in various ways, and we can nicely ignore the Supreme. And the material energy is nicely designed in such a way that it makes this possible. You know, the Supreme Lord is everything. He's everywhere. But we look around and we don't see him anywhere. He's everywhere, but we don't see him anywhere. And this is a testimony to the potency of the external energy, that it can hide the Supreme Lord so well that we can be looking right directly at him and not have a clue. So the material world is this special place that gets expanded and then contracted. Of course, this is not happening in the spiritual world. The spiritual world is not expanded and contracted. Only material world is. And as living entities go from one lifetime to another, they have various pastimes and a various kind of karma, and they create new karma. Their material desires change a little bit. They go from one kind of thing to another, and on we go from one lifetime to another until, you know, just like children in a preschool schoolroom, the bell rings, and at that point it's over. The material world, either we have the end of Brahma's day or we have the entire material world folding up. And when it folds up, it's kind of like, time's up. Everybody back into the Brahman. So everybody has to go back into the body of Garbha Vishnu if the material universe is winding up for Brahma's end of his day. But if it's winding up the total deal at the end of Brahma's lifetime, then everybody has to go back into the body of it's Garbha Vishnu if it's the end of the day, and it's Mahavishnu if it's the end of the entire universe. So the living entities once again merge back in. They nicely sleep for a long time, for the time that he is, everything is unmanifested. Then when the manifestation happens again, Brahma has to do his deal. He has to make everything come out again and separate various planets and create systems and, you know, get everything ready. And then the living entities can come out and do their dance, and then we do this whole thing over and over again. So it's also kind of a play, but this play is not so much fun in the material world. In the material world, there's all kinds of horrible things going on. That's why those who are intelligent will think, okay, let me get out of here and go back to the spiritual world. And through devotional service, this is possible. I want to leave some time for questions, so I've tried to kind of go over some of the main concepts here. Another interesting word that for the first time I picked up on is gopayati, which means to maintain. There's other words for it, but here the word is gopayati. So the Supreme Lord maintains all these planetary systems, and he maintains the living entities within them. And of course that famous verse, Nityo Nityanam Chaitanas Chaitananam Eko Bahonam Yo Vidadati Kaman, that Nityo is one living entity, Nityanam out of many living entities. many eternals. Nityo is eternal, so one eternal, Nityanam, out of many eternals. Chaitanas is living entity, Chaitananam, out of many living entities. So we're contrasting a single with a multitude. So one with many. So Nityo, one eternal. Nityana, many eternals. Chaitanas, one eternal. Chaitananam, many eternals. What's the, now that's the subject. So what's the predicate? The predicate is Nityo Nityanam, Chaitanas Chaitanam, Eko, one, Bahonam, the many, Vididati Kaman. He delivers their desires, Kaman. So the one is able to fulfill the desires of the many. So there's only one person in that category, and that's the Supreme Lord. He's able to fulfill our desires. We cannot fulfill our desires, nor can we fulfill each other's desires. Only the Supreme Lord is actually able to do that. So he's in a special category. And again, this Tad Ikshata Bahusham, that comes from the Chandogya Upanishad, actually. So we have these two kind of interesting verses. Any questions, comments?
In terms of like doing or reading about the creation and like how one thing goes from another, where are the relevant sections in the Bhagavatam?
It's a number of places. It's later on in the second canto we get some of this. We get a lot of it in, where is the whole thing about Kapila Dev and Devahuti? That's fourth canto or third?
326.
Yeah. It's quite convoluted, actually, you know, that you have first from the Brahman you get the Pradhan, which is totally undifferentiated, so it's in equilibrium. Then it's disturbed out of equilibrium and it begins to manifest first the false ego, then the false ego manifests into the three modes of nature: goodness, passion, ignorance. Goodness merges again with the false ego and creates the demigods and some other things. And the mode of passion merges with the false ego and creates the senses and sense objects, the subtle sense objects, which are parts of, the 24 elements of Sankhya. And finally, the mode of ignorance merges with the false ego and creates the gross material elements: earth, water, fire, air, and ether. So this is the Mahatattva. It's one thing transforming into another. I think of it kind of as, you have one thing which is kind of a bland, undifferentiated sort of energy, and then it becomes disturbed, and now you have false ego, and then the false ego subdivides but also remains at the same time. So because the false ego is the first thing that seems to manifest out of the Mahatat. So the Mahatat is, I believe it's the Mahatat is where the Pradhan is now disturbed. It's no longer in equilibrium. And so it's kind of like watching clouds sort of precipitate out various things, so from the, these are all things that are at the very, very abstract and imperceptible level of, expansion. But they gradually become more and more perceptible and differentiated, which is why we have this world of 10,000 objects or 10,000 things, as they say in Chinese, So We gradually come from this bland stuff which changes a little bit, and it becomes first the false ego, and then the three modes of nature. Those two interact with each other. The false ego interacts with mode of goodness, false ego interacts with the mode of passion, false ego interacts with the mode of ignorance, and the 24 elements of Sankhya philosophy are generated. Still, this is at a high level of abstraction, and then that gradually is where the lotus flower grows out of the navel of Garbha Vishnu. Brahma comes out, and then Brahma takes it to the next stage where he creates planetary systems, and eventually has to start creating Prajapatis, and then we get what we see today. So this is a whole, how we go from very subtle, very bland to differentiated in all these colors and varieties of the world that we actually see around us. Stephen Knapp, or our Sri Nanda Nandana, has written a book that nicely kind of pulls the whole thing together and explains in where these different things are described in different parts of Bhagavatam. So, we find that as far as the material elements go, you have first sound, and from sound is generated ether, and ether generates form, and form generates fire, and then fire generates touch, and touch generates air, air generates taste, and taste generates water, water generates smell, and smell generates earth. It's something like that, that we have this ping-ponging back and forth between these subtle elements and the gross elements, the subtle sense objects, I should say, not subtle elements, but subtle sense objects, and the gross elements. It goes back and forth between one and another. At the end, you have the whole thing. Each one, the subsequent level, is denser and more palpable or more perceivable by our senses than the previous one. Yeah.
You were mentioning that Carl Sagan was saying something about how the Vedic time scale is the only one amongst all different whatever traditions, I guess. I'm not sure what
religions, yeah.
Yeah, that was on the same scale as the modern scientific world.
Right.
And my godbrother has actually put a book together, and he shows all these different significant Vedic time events.
Yeah.
And it shows how they actually closely correspond to different significant geological and other events that modern science has been speculating so hard for hundreds of years to reach a date. And you see that in their numbers, they're always approaching the Vedic date. It's been sitting there waiting for them.
Right. The Ordovician, the Cambrian, the all these kind of huge epochs of time, which are in the hundreds of thousands and millions of years and things like that. So I just thought that was interesting. There's even a YouTube video out where Carl Sagan is walking into a temple in India, and he's describing this whole business, saying that in the Indian religion is the only place where we see time scales that are similar, no doubt by accident. That's it just has to be accident. It could not possibly have any actual correlation. But at any rate, that's kind of, I think, interesting, that these time scales are vast, that the universe is an intricate thing, and it goes through periods of time where different things happen. And it's quite plain, even in our modern world, that our modern view of history is just wrong in so many ways. The most obvious thing is this idea that human beings, first started to form some kind of civilized, towns and villages somewhere like 10 or 11,000 years ago. But then we've got things like the pyramids. So these, cavemen were sitting around, hacking pieces of meat off some beast and putting them into a fire, and ugh ugh and oog oog, they didn't know anything, they didn't have anything. And then they suddenly start building pyramids, so pyramids with precision that we couldn't match today. And so it doesn't make any sense. Nobody talks about this, but there's all these, megaliths and monuments and things on this earth that are obviously ancient. They don't even know how ancient. These, Stonehenge and Göbekli Tepe and Derinkuyu and Tiwanaku, all these places in South America and in Turkey, in all over the world. These places exist, which make no sense. They show an advanced civilization making something we would have trouble making today, and supposedly it was just cavemen back then. So this is why our modern explanation of history makes no sense. The pyramids are built with a precision that would be hard for us to do today. The straightness of the baselines of the pyramid are at a tolerance that's higher than buildings in New York City are expected to follow. So these things demonstrate that somebody was doing something way back then that we would have trouble matching now. And of course, the weirdest thing is if you go to Egypt and you see these slabs of marble or sometimes other materials that are perfectly flat. How did they do that? We don't know. It looks like it had to be some kind of saw, because you can't pick with some kind of crude implement a perfectly glossy flat surface. It's not possible. You just can't do it. So how did they do that? And there are many people now that have investigated the whole idea that how did they make these tombs that were perfectly square and perfectly flat on all edges, and on top of it, some of them were drilled out inside. Now, how did they do that? It's one piece. On the inside, it's drilled out. So nobody could figure how to do that today, what to speak. So then you've got these tube holes bored into things. How were they doing that? They see that there's bit edges, so someone was using very advanced technology, obviously, in an ancient time. So the Vedic picture gives us this idea of civilizations kind of rising and then disappearing and then rising and disappearing, similar to this whole thing of the material universe is coming and going, coming and going. So this gives the Vedic perspective a little bit of an edge over the scientific perspective, because we can account for these things, but modern science just kind of shuts the door on it. Egyptologists don't want to talk about any of this stuff. Archaeologists don't really like to talk about it. Anthropologists avoid these kind of things, like, they're cursed. So they, because it doesn't square with our, idea that humans, came about, I don't know, what was it, 25, 50,000 years ago or something like that, but then they were just basically almost monkeys, and then, you know, now 10,000 years ago, they stopped being monkeys and started building pyramids, you know, all this kind of stuff. This is where, you know, a lot of people are aware of this now. It's not something that's so hidden as it once was. So it becomes kind of a good preaching on inlet, where you can kind of explain to people that, you know, what was going on here? Why was it like this? You know, how did ancient people manage to do these things that we'd have trouble doing today? So we're getting late here. Anybody else have any questions or comments? I don't want to keep you from breakfast. Yeah.
Just quickly, related to what you were saying, this also relates to the dating of the Vedas, the Vedic scriptures, because there's a complete unwillingness in the scholarly community to even look for a real date for the Vedas. And of course we have one. There's an astrologer, Aryan, an ancient astrologer from India, who dated everything using astronomical dating, which is proved to be accurate in other cases. But what scholars forget is that the unwillingness to acknowledge the ancient character of the Vedic scriptures was intentional by European colonizers who were Christian.
Right,
So
right.
it wasn't accidental.
Right, it wasn't accidental.
And then when they converted to atheist humanism or whatever, they carried over the same unwillingness
Yeah,
to
yeah.
acknowledge. So
We have lots of people to thank for this, you know. You know, Max Muller, for one, you know, with the Indian invasion, Aryan invasion theory and all that, which has never been proven and is still taught in books today, you know, although there's no evidence of any incursion from these mysterious northern peoples who were, you know, in some ways it's a running joke, because every culture has had their, you know, day in the sun of thinking it was them who delivered this Vedic knowledge to the poor, you know, Aboriginal Indians, you know, from somewhere in the north. Hitler was sure it was the Germans, you know, others have thought it was the Scandinavians, others it was, you know, some other part of Europe somehow went down there. But I think the thing that scared everybody was when the original scientific investigators, anthropologists, went into India and they discovered that Latin was so close to Sanskrit, and that was too much. You know, could possibly the whole of Western civilization have been preceded by the Indian civilization? No way, we can't live with that. And so, thank you, Max Muller. He came up with the Aryan invasion theory. Of course, modern scholarship dates the Vedas at no more than 1,100 years old or something like that. That's, you know, what you'll hear in Indology classes in colleges, you know, that it was, you know, not that old, and they have various dates for it. But, you know, we have that the Vedas were written 5,000 years ago by Vedavyas, not by Vopadev and not by, you know, a team of mysterious missing scholars. You know, this is, you know, there's no substantiation for any of this. But this is what gets taught in schools. And of course, you know, we have this whole explanation that the first scholars who went into India, as you were saying, the first scholars that went into India went in with one purpose, and that was to debunk Vedic knowledge so they could make people Christians. And then that started things off on the wrong foot, because they were purposefully misinterpreting everything. Then the next group that went in there weren't Christians, they were atheists, you know. And for them, they were just scientists, and they didn't think any of it had any credence. So they put their spin on it, and this, all this jumbo, you know, mumbo jumbo, is still the way the Western world relates to the ancient writings of India, unfortunately. Okay, so anyway, thank you all very much for your kind attention. All glories to the Śhrīmad-Bhāgavatam. All glories to the Vaishnava devotees. Hare Krishna.